You ever get arrested for trespassing on land your family has owned for more than a century? Because that's exactly how my inheritance story began. The smell of wet pine and mountain earth drifted through the open window of my truck as I followed a winding gravel road deeper into the valley. Morning fog hung low between the ridges, turning the entire landscape into something that looked more like a painting than real life. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and slowed as the road curved around a stand of cedar trees. My name is Ethan Walker, and 3 weeks earlier, I inherited 6,800 acres of mountain valley land from my grandfather. At least, that's what the paperwork said. According to the people I was about to meet, I didn't own a single inch of it. The tires crunched over loose gravel as I rounded the final bend. That was when I saw the gate. It stretched across the road like it had always belonged there. Black wrought iron, stone pillars, security cameras mounted overhead, and right in the center, polished brass letters gleaming in the morning sun. Willow Creek Estates. Residents only. I stared at the sign for several seconds. My grandfather never built a gate. Hell, he barely believed in fences. The old man used to say a valley this beautiful didn't belong behind walls. Yet here it was, a gate standing directly on land that had carried our family name since 1917. I rolled down my window. The scent of fresh-cut grass mixed with something else. Expensive landscaping. Someone had spent serious money here. A security cart approached from inside the gate. The electric motor hummed softly as a man in a pressed uniform stepped out, holding a clipboard. He looked to be in his 40s. Clean-shaven. Perfectly professional. "Morning, sir," he said. "Resident pass?" I smiled politely. "I won't need one." His expression tightened slightly. "Everyone entering Willow Creek Estates needs authorization." "Actually," I replied, reaching into my folder, "I'm Ethan Walker." Nothing. No reaction. "Okay," he said. "Do you have a property address inside the community?" I looked past him toward the valley beyond the gate. My valley. The place where I learned to fish. The place where my grandfather taught me how to track deer and repair fence posts and tell the weather by looking at the clouds. I could still remember the smell of wood smoke drifting from his cabin during cold autumn mornings. "I own the valley," I said. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then the guard laughed. Not a nervous laugh. A genuine laugh. Like I had just told him the funniest joke he'd heard all week. "Sir," he said, still smiling, "the HOA owns Willow Creek Estates." I opened the folder and pulled out the inheritance documents. "No," I said calmly. "My family owns 6,800 acres of this valley. We've owned it for over 100 years. Before he could answer, another sound drifted through the morning air. Tires rolling across pavement. A white luxury SUV approached from deeper inside the development and stopped near the gate. The driver stepped out wearing a tailored cream-colored jacket and sunglasses that probably cost more than my monthly truck payment. Even from 50 feet away, I could tell exactly who she was. Patricia Holloway, HOA president. The woman whose name appeared on nearly every document I'd reviewed during the previous week. She walked toward me with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Her smile looked friendly enough, but her eyes never softened. "Can I help you?" she asked. I introduced myself. The moment I said the name Walker, something flashed across her face. Not surprise. Recognition. She knew exactly who I was, which meant she also knew exactly what land she was standing on. "Mr. Walker," she said sweetly, "I'm afraid there must be some confusion." The smell of expensive perfume floated through the air as she stopped beside the security guard. Behind her, I could see rooftops scattered across hillsides that used to be open pasture. Dozens of them. Maybe more. "There's no confusion," I replied. "I inherited this property." Patricia smiled wider. "No, you inherited paperwork. This community has been here for years." Then she pointed toward the gate. "And unless you're a resident, I'll have to ask you to leave." The words settled over the valley like a storm cloud. Leave. She was telling me to leave my own land. For a moment, all I could hear was the distant rustle of pine trees in the wind and the faint creak of the gate standing between me and my family's valley. Then Patricia reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "If necessary," she said, "I can call the sheriff." I looked at the houses beyond the gate. The roads. The clubhouse roof visible on a distant hill. The landscaped entrances. The security cameras. An entire community sitting comfortably inside land they apparently believed belonged to them. And standing there in the cool mountain air, Listening to an HOA president threaten to remove me from my own inheritance, I realized something. This wasn't going to be a property dispute. This was going to be a reckoning. The sheriff never came. Patricia stood there for another minute wearing that practiced smile, waiting for me to argue, waiting for me to lose my temper, waiting for me to become the villain in whatever story she had already prepared for the residents of Willow Creek Estates. Instead, I simply nodded, climbed back into my truck, and drove away. The crunch of gravel beneath my tires faded behind me as the gate disappeared in the rearview mirror. But the image stayed burned into my mind. That sign, those stone pillars, those houses scattered across hillsides where cattle once grazed. By the time I reached the highway, I realized something that bothered me more than Patricia's arrogance. She had recognized my last name immediately. That meant she knew exactly who my family was. And if she knew who my family was, then she knew this valley belonged to the Walkers. The smell of old paper and cedar greeted me 3 hours later when I unlocked the storage room behind my grandfather's cabin. The cabin sat near the northern ridge overlooking the entire valley. It was one of the few structures still untouched by the development spreading below. My grandfather built it himself in 1968. Every board, every nail, every stone in the fireplace. Dust floated through beams of afternoon sunlight as I stepped inside. The place felt frozen in time. His old rocking chair still faced the valley. His coffee mug still sat on the shelf beside a weathered radio that had not worked in years. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice again. Deep, calm, patient. The kind of voice that never needed to be loud to command respect. Growing up, I spent every summer here. While other kids went to amusement parks, I followed my grandfather through 6,800 acres of mountains, forests, meadows, streams, and open range. He taught me how to read survey markers before I learned algebra. He taught me how to follow property lines using nothing but landmarks and old maps. Most importantly, he taught me that land carried memory. Every fence post, every creek crossing, every ridge had a story attached to it. The rough wooden floor creaked beneath my boots as I moved deeper into the cabin. I stopped beside a large map hanging on the wall. The edges had yellowed with age. Red lines traced the valley boundaries. Walker Valley. That was what everyone called it when I was young. Not Willow Creek Estates. Not some manufactured community name invented by a marketing consultant. Walker Valley. The name was printed right there in faded black ink. I ran my fingers across the map and felt a knot tighten in my chest. My grandfather never sold this land. Neither did my father. After my father passed away unexpectedly 15 years earlier, ownership transferred into a family trust. The trust managed taxes, maintenance, and legal obligations while the property remained untouched. At least that was the plan. The problem was that nobody in the family actually lived there anymore. I spent most of my career working as a land survey engineer across several western states. My mother moved to Arizona. My sister settled in Oregon. The valley became one of those places everyone loved, but nobody actively watched. Apparently, somebody else noticed. I opened a filing cabinet near the fireplace and began sorting through old records. Tax receipts, survey reports, grazing permits, water rights. Decades of paperwork filled the drawers. Everything appeared organized exactly the way my grandfather left it. The scent of aged paper grew stronger as I pulled out another folder. Then another. Then another. Outside, wind rustled through pine branches, creating a soft whisper against the cabin walls. Hours passed without me noticing. As sunlight slowly shifted across the room, a pattern started emerging. Around 12 years earlier, references to neighboring parcels suddenly became more frequent. Utility requests, road access discussions, development proposals, environmental surveys. Someone had been studying the valley long before the first house appeared. My eyes stopped on a particular document dated 9 years ago. A request from a development group seeking access through the southern entrance. Denied. Another request followed 6 months later. Denied again. Then another. Denied. 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 My grandfather had refused every single attempt to develop the valley while he was alive. I leaned back in the chair and stared through the cabin window toward the distant rooftops below. Golden evening light reflected off dozens of windows. Maybe hundreds. An entire community now stood where development had once been forbidden. The realization settled over me slowly. Somebody had waited until the one man standing in their way was gone. And whatever happened afterward was not an accident. It was a plan. The next morning, a cold mist blanketed the valley as I drove toward the county records office. The smell of rain-soaked asphalt drifted through the truck's air vents while my mind kept replaying the documents I had found in the cabin. Somebody had not simply built a neighborhood. Somebody had built an entire narrative. By the time I reached town, the courthouse clock tower was striking 9. Inside, the building smelled like old paper, floor polish, and history. I spent most of my career reading survey maps and property descriptions, so county records felt more comfortable to me than most living rooms. The clerk at the records counter greeted me politely until I introduced myself. The moment I said Walker, her expression changed. Not hostile, just surprised. "I thought that land belonged to Willow Creek Estates," she said. There it was again. The same assumption. The same story everyone seemed to believe. I forced a smile and asked for every filing connected to the valley during the past 15 years. 2 hours later, stacks of documents covered an entire research table. The soft hum of fluorescent lights echoed above me while I sorted through deeds, easements, permits, zoning applications, and development plans. The deeper I dug, the stranger the picture became. There was no deed transferring ownership of the valley. No sale. No court order. No inheritance dispute. Legally speaking, the land had never left the Walker family trust. Yet somehow hundreds of people now live there. The first clue appeared in a development proposal filed 11 years earlier. The proposal described Willow Creek Estates as a future recreational community adjacent to privately owned mountain acreage. Adjacent. Not inside. Adjacent. But 3 years later, the language changed. New filings described community amenities located within Willow Creek Valley. Then came road permits, utility expansions, water line installations. Every year the footprint grew larger. It was like watching a slow-motion invasion hidden beneath layers of paperwork. Nobody ever claimed ownership directly. They simply acted as though ownership did not matter. By lunchtime, I found Patricia Holloway's name. Then I found it again. And again. Board president, development liaison, community representative, planning coordinator. Her signature appeared everywhere. The woman had spent nearly a decade positioning herself at the center of every major decision connected to the valley. I leaned back in my chair and stared through the courthouse window. Outside, people walked along Main Street carrying coffee cups and shopping bags. Ordinary lives. Ordinary routines. Meanwhile, an entire community had somehow convinced itself that 6,800 acres of private property belonged to them. The more I learned, the less accidental it seemed. Around 3 o'clock, an older surveyor named Frank Dawson approached my table. I recognized him immediately. He had worked county surveys for nearly 40 years before retiring. His weathered face looked exactly the same as I remembered. "You are Harold Walker's grandson, aren't you?" he asked quietly. I nodded. Frank glanced around before lowering his voice. "Your grandfather knew this day would come." A chill ran through me despite the warm room. Frank pulled out a chair and sat down. The leather creaked beneath his weight. "About 10 years ago, developers started circling the valley. Your grandfather turned them down every time. Some accepted it. Others did not. I asked him about Patricia." Frank exhaled slowly. "She arrived after the first investors failed. Smart woman. Patient woman. She understood something most people did not." "What was that?" I asked. Frank folded his hands. "Most property owners defend land from the outside. She figured out how to occupy it from the inside." The words hung in the air between us. Frank explained how a small vacation community appeared near the southern edge years earlier. A handful of homes became a dozen. A dozen became 50. Then came community facilities, private roads, security services, and homeowner associations. Every expansion seemed minor on its own. No single step attracted enough attention to trigger major scrutiny. But over time, the community grew into something massive. Something that looked permanent. Something people assumed had always been there. As afternoon sunlight stretched across the courthouse floor, Frank gave me one final piece of advice before leaving. "Do not focus on the houses," he said. "Focus on the story they are telling. If you can prove the story is false, everything else falls apart." After he walked away, I sat alone staring at the valley records spread across the table. For the first time, I realized the real problem was not the buildings. It was belief. Hundreds of residents believed they belonged there. County officials believed Willow Creek Estates belonged there. Even the security guard at the gate believed it. And the most dangerous part of all was that Patricia Holloway had spent years making sure everyone believed the same lie. 2 days later, I decided it was time to stop reading records and start studying the people who lived behind that gate. The morning air carried the scent of fresh mulch and cut grass as I parked my truck outside a small coffee shop near the entrance to the development. From a corner table beside the window, I had a clear view of residents coming and going. Luxury SUVs rolled through the gate every few minutes. Golf carts buzzed along private paths. Landscapers moved with military precision across perfectly maintained lawns. On the surface, everything looked peaceful, normal, successful. That was exactly what made the situation so strange. Nobody acted like they were squatting on private land. They acted like they belonged there. Around mid-morning, I noticed something else. Nearly every resident waved to the security staff by name. They stopped to chat. They laughed. They discussed community events and neighborhood projects. This was not some temporary occupation. Patricia had built something much more powerful than houses. She had built trust. By noon, I found myself standing inside the community clubhouse during an open public event advertised online. The building sat on a ridge overlooking the valley. Large stone fireplaces, expansive windows, polished wood beams overhead. The faint smell of coffee and cinnamon drifted through the lobby. Everywhere I looked, framed photographs celebrated the history of Willow Creek Estates. That caught my attention immediately. History. I walked toward a display wall covered with pictures and timelines. According to the exhibit, the community's story began 12 years ago when visionary local residents transformed underutilized mountain property into a thriving neighborhood. Underutilized? I almost laughed. That single word erased nearly a century of my family's ownership. It erased my grandfather, my father, every survey marker, every grazing permit, every tax payment. Entire generations reduced to one convenient sentence. As I studied the display, a voice interrupted my thoughts. Beautiful community, isn't it? I turned and found Patricia Holloway standing beside me. Her smile appeared effortless. Her posture relaxed. To anyone watching, she looked like the perfect community leader. Depends who you ask, I said. Her eyes narrowed slightly before the smile returned. Still researching? She asked. Still protecting what belongs to my family. She folded her arms and glanced toward the photographs. You know, Mr. Walker, ownership is an interesting concept. The smell of expensive perfume mixed with fresh coffee as she stepped closer. Land means very little if nobody uses it. People built lives here, raised children here, created a community here. I looked around the clubhouse. Families chatted near the fireplace. Retirees played cards at nearby tables. Young couples reviewed event calendars posted on bulletin boards. Patricia was not entirely wrong. These people had built lives here. The problem was that none of them seemed to know the full story. Did you ever tell them who owned the valley? I asked quietly. For the first time, her smile faltered. Only for a second, but I saw it. The residents know everything they need to know, she replied. Then she turned and walked away. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but it told me more than any document I had found so far. Patricia was not worried about the law. She was worried about perception. That evening, I stayed near the valley and continued observing. The golden light of sunset painted the hillsides in shades of orange and gold. Children rode bicycles along paved paths. Neighbors gathered on porches. Sprinkler systems hissed softly across green lawns. It looked like the picture of suburban success. Yet every time I saw a street sign or community marker, I noticed something. The names. Holloway Ridge, Founders Circle, Willow Creek Parkway. Patricia's influence was everywhere. The entire valley had been rewritten around a new identity. As darkness settled across the mountains, I parked near an overlook above the community. Lights flickered on throughout the valley below like scattered stars. Hundreds of homes, hundreds of families, hundreds of people who genuinely believed they were part of something permanent. I understood then why Frank Dawson warned me not to focus on the houses. The real challenge was larger than property lines. Patricia had spent years building an illusion so complete that even honest people accepted it as truth. And if I wanted to reclaim what belonged to my family, I would first have to uncover exactly how that illusion had been created. 3 days later, Patricia gave me exactly what I needed. The invitation arrived through a community newsletter posted publicly online. Willow Creek Estates would be holding its annual Founders Celebration at the clubhouse. According to the announcement, residents would gather to celebrate the visionaries who transformed the valley into one of the most desirable communities in the region. The moment I read those words, I knew I was going. The evening air carried the scent of barbecue and cedar smoke as I parked near the clubhouse. Strings of lights stretched between trees. Live music drifted across the hillside. Laughter echoed from the outdoor pavilion overlooking the valley. If somebody arrived without knowing the history, they would assume this place had existed forever. Families mingled between food stations. Children chased each other across manicured lawns. Couples sat beneath patio heaters watching the sunset paint the mountains orange and gold. I walked quietly through the crowd, listening. That was when I started hearing the stories. A retired teacher told friends she moved here because she loved the community spirit. A young family talked about saving for years to buy their dream home inside Willow Creek Estates. An older man proudly described helping build one of the first neighborhood trails. None of them sounded dishonest. None of them sounded like opportunists. Most seemed completely unaware that the land beneath their homes belonged to someone else. That realization bothered me more than I expected. Patricia had not simply built houses. She had built an entire mythology. Every conversation reinforced the same narrative. The founders saved the valley. The founders improved the valley. The founders created opportunity where none existed before. The actual owner never appeared in those stories. Near sunset, residents gathered beneath a large pavilion overlooking the valley floor. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with mountain air as people took their seats. At the front stood a massive display featuring photographs from the community's early years. Patricia stepped onto the stage to applause. She looked completely at home beneath the lights. Confident, admired, untouchable. Her voice carried easily across the crowd. She thanked volunteers, praised community leaders, celebrated growth and prosperity. Then she began talking about the valley itself. This land represents vision, she said. Years ago, people saw empty wilderness. We saw possibility. Applause followed. I felt my jaw tighten. Empty wilderness. The phrase landed like a stone. My grandfather's cabin was still standing less than 2 miles away. Property taxes had been paid every year. Survey markers remained in place. Legal ownership had never changed. Yet somehow the official story described the valley as abandoned. Patricia continued speaking. Communities thrive when people are willing to invest in the future. More applause. The crowd loved her. Why would they not? Most of them believed every word. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly woman sitting beside me leaned closer. You are Ethan Walker, aren't you? She asked softly. I turned toward her. Her silver hair reflected the glow of the pavilion lights. I nodded. I thought so, she said. You look exactly like your grandfather. My pulse quickened. You knew him? She smiled sadly. Everyone knew Harold Walker. The music from the stage faded into the background as she spoke. Her name was Eleanor Pierce. She had lived near the valley for more than 40 years. She remembered my grandfather personally. More importantly, she remembered the early days of Willow Creek Estates. Things changed after he got older, she said quietly. The developers kept coming. He always said no. The smell of rain drifted in on a cool breeze as clouds gathered over the distant mountains. Eleanor lowered her voice even further. Then one day people started acting as though the valley had no owner. I asked how that happened. Her expression darkened. Most people never saw the beginning. They only saw what came later. New roads, new homes, new signs. After a few years, the original story disappeared. On stage, Patricia was receiving another round of applause. The crowd stood to celebrate her leadership. Eleanor watched silently for several seconds. Then she looked back at me. There is something else you should know. The music swelled as residents gathered around the stage. Nobody paid attention to us. Nobody noticed the tension in Eleanor's voice. Years ago, she said, your grandfather hid something in that cabin. He told me if anyone ever tried to take the valley, the truth would still be waiting there. My heartbeat quickened. What truth? Eleanor glanced toward Patricia before answering. I do not know. He never told me. He only said that someday his grandson would come looking for it. Suddenly the celebration around me felt very far away. The laughter, the music, the applause. All of it faded beneath a single thought. My grandfather had expected this to happen, and somewhere inside that old cabin, he had left something behind. That night the valley felt different. The wind moving through the pines sounded less like weather and more like a voice trying to tell me something I had missed. By the time I reached the cabin, the moon had climbed above the eastern ridge, casting pale silver light across the porch my grandfather built with his own hands. The old boards creaked beneath my boots as I unlocked the door. Inside, the familiar scent of cedar, dust, and aged paper wrapped around me like a memory. Eleanor's words echoed in my head. He told me the truth would still be waiting there. I stood in the center of the cabin and looked around slowly. For days I had searched filing cabinets, drawers, shelves, and storage trunks. If my grandfather hid something important, it was not going to be sitting in plain sight. The silence inside the cabin felt almost heavy. Somewhere outside, an owl called from the trees. I grabbed a flashlight and began searching again. This time I paid attention to details. The fireplace stones, the floorboards, the walls. Every inch of the cabin carried my grandfather's fingerprints. He had been a surveyor before retiring, the kind of man who trusted measurements more than opinions. If he left something behind, there would be logic behind it. 2 hours passed. Midnight came and went. I found nothing. Frustration started creeping in. The beam from my flashlight swept across the room one more time before stopping on the large map hanging above the fireplace. The same map I had studied earlier. Walker Valley, 6,800 acres outlined in faded red ink. Something about it suddenly felt wrong. I stepped closer. The frame seemed thicker than necessary. My fingers traced the edge of the wood. Then I felt it. A small metal latch hidden beneath the lower corner. My pulse immediately quickened. The latch released with a soft click. Behind the map sat a narrow compartment built directly into the wall. My grandfather had hidden it so carefully that nobody would ever notice unless they knew exactly where to look. Inside rested a weathered leather portfolio wrapped in oilcloth. The material crackled softly as I unfolded it on the table. The smell of old leather and paper filled the room. Dozens of documents sat neatly organized inside. Original survey records, handwritten notes, boundary certifications, historical correspondence. But one document immediately stood out. It was thicker than the others and carried an official county seal. The date at the top stopped me cold. 1962. I carefully turned the pages. The words became more unbelievable with each paragraph. My grandfather had not simply owned the valley. He had established a protected land charter covering nearly the entire property. The agreement created specific restrictions on future development, subdivision, and occupancy. More importantly, the charter had never been terminated. Legally, it still existed. I sat back in stunned silence. The cabin felt completely still around me. Outside, wind rattled branches against the roof. Inside, my entire understanding of the situation had just changed. Then I found the second document, and that one was even bigger. It was a legal memorandum prepared decades earlier by a land use attorney. Attached to it were maps showing every approved access route into the valley. Every road, every easement, every utility corridor. My eyes moved across the diagrams again and again. There was only one problem. None of the roads currently serving Willow Creek Estates appeared anywhere in the approved records. Not one. The community's primary entrance, the security gate, the internal road network, the utility expansions. None matched the authorized filings preserved in the portfolio. The metallic taste of adrenaline filled my mouth as the implications became clear. For years, everyone had focused on ownership. Patricia wanted the argument to stay there because ownership could be debated in public perception. But access rights were different. Access rights depended entirely on documentation. And according to the documents spread across my grandfather's table, the entire community had been operating through infrastructure that never received lawful authorization from the actual property owner. I continued reading until nearly dawn. Every page revealed another piece of the puzzle. My grandfather had anticipated future development pressure. He had documented everything. Every boundary marker, every agreement, every restriction. At the very bottom of the portfolio rested a sealed envelope addressed in his handwriting. My name appeared on the front. Ethan Walker. The sight of those words sent a chill through me. With shaking hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of paper. The note contained only one sentence. If you are reading this, They finally forgot the one thing that matters most. Follow the roads. The sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge when I started following the roads. A thin layer of morning fog drifted through the valley floor, while dew shimmered across the grass like scattered glass. My grandfather's note sat folded in my shirt pocket. Follow the roads. For simple words. For words that had kept me awake most of the night. As a survey engineer, I understood something most people never think about. Roads tell stories. They reveal who had permission, who had access, and who controlled the land. Every curve, every intersection, every easement leaves a paper trail. The smell of wet earth filled the air as I drove slowly along the perimeter of the development. Instead of looking at houses, I focused on infrastructure, utility boxes, drainage systems, road markers, survey pins, the details most people ignore. Within 2 hours, I started noticing inconsistencies. Several road sections crossed parcels that should have required signed easement agreements. Others cut directly through protected areas identified in the land charter. One particular access road caught my attention immediately. It connected the southern entrance to the main residential district. Hundreds of vehicles used it every day, yet according to my grandfather's records, that corridor had never been authorized. The realization sent a surge of energy through me. If the road lacked legal authorization, then everything depending on that road could become vulnerable. I spent the next week documenting everything. The rhythmic click of my camera became as familiar as breathing. Morning after morning, I photographed road alignments, utility corridors, gate locations, and survey markers. Every evening, I compared what I found against historical records. The deeper I dug, the clearer the pattern became. Willow Creek Estates had expanded through assumption rather than authorization. Instead of obtaining proper approvals, somebody simply kept building. Then they acted as though the approvals existed. The strategy worked because nobody challenged it. By Friday afternoon, my dining table inside the cabin had disappeared beneath maps and documents. Colored markers connected roads to permits. Permits connected to easements. Easements connected to ownership records. The entire puzzle slowly assembled itself in front of me. Outside, rain tapped softly against the cabin windows while I studied the final pieces. Then I saw it. The same name appeared repeatedly throughout the expansion records. Not Patricia Holloway. Another name. Robert Kessler, a land development consultant hired during the earliest phases of the community. Unlike Patricia, Robert signed engineering reviews, infrastructure applications, and planning submissions. His fingerprints were everywhere. Curious, I started researching him. What I discovered made my stomach tighten. Robert had retired 6 years earlier and moved 2 counties away. Better yet, he had testified in multiple land use disputes during his career. People like Robert documented everything. The following Monday, I drove to his property. The smell of fresh hay drifted across open pasture as I parked near a modest ranch house. Robert greeted me cautiously at first. That changed the moment I mentioned Walker Valley. His expression shifted instantly. He knew exactly why I was there. We spent nearly 3 hours talking on his porch while wind rustled through nearby cottonwood trees. Most of the conversation centered on technical details. Surveys, easements, development approvals. Then Robert said something I will never forget. Patricia always believed perception mattered more than paperwork. He stared toward the distant hills before continuing. I warned her that assumption is not ownership. My pulse quickened. Did she know the roads were unauthorized? Robert sighed heavily. Everyone involved knew. They just convinced themselves nobody would ever challenge it. The afternoon sun reflected off the porch railing as silence settled between us. Finally, Robert stood and disappeared inside his house. A few minutes later, he returned carrying a weathered storage box. He placed it on the table between us. The cardboard smelled faintly of dust and old paper. I kept copies, he said quietly. Inside sat engineering drafts, correspondence, planning notes, and internal reviews dating back nearly a decade. The first document I opened contained a sentence highlighted in yellow. Existing access routes remain dependent upon unresolved property authorization issues. I stared at the words for several seconds. There it was. The truth. Not hidden. Not lost. Simply ignored. Robert watched me carefully. You understand what that means, don't you? I nodded slowly. For months, I had been searching for proof that the community stood on land it did not own. Now I had found something far more powerful. Proof that the people responsible knew it all along. As I drove back toward the valley that evening, the The mountains glowed beneath the setting sun. The gate, the roads, the clubhouse. The entire illusion suddenly looked different. Patricia believed she had spent years building an untouchable kingdom. What she failed to realize was that kingdoms do not collapse because of one dramatic mistake. They collapse because somebody finally follows the road back to where the truth began. For the next 3 weeks, I said almost nothing. That was the part Patricia never saw coming. Most people rush toward confrontation the moment they think they have evidence. I did the opposite. I let her keep talking. I let the HOA keep operating. I let every board meeting, every newsletter, every public statement add another layer to the record. The smell of fresh coffee became a permanent fixture inside the cabin as I spent long nights organizing documents into timelines. Every permit, every easement, every engineering review, every letter. The stack grew higher each day. Meanwhile, Willow Creek Estates continued celebrating itself. Community newsletters praised new expansion projects. Board members discussed future improvements. Patricia appeared in local newspapers discussing responsible growth and community stewardship. Every public appearance helped me. Every statement created another opportunity for comparison against the actual records. By the end of the month, my legal team had assembled a case file thick enough to fill an entire storage box. More importantly, we had something even stronger than ownership records. We had a documented history showing that key decision makers knew about unresolved authorization problems and continued building anyway. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at the County Administrative Center. The day arrived cold and gray. Rain tapped softly against the windshield as I parked outside the building. The air smelled like wet concrete and freshly cut grass. Residents began arriving shortly after sunrise. Many looked confused. Others looked concerned. Rumors had spread throughout the community for weeks, but very few people understood what was actually happening. Inside the hearing room, rows of seats filled quickly. County officials reviewed documents. Attorneys organized binders. Reporters set up cameras near the back wall. The low murmur of conversation echoed across the room. Then Patricia arrived. She walked through the doors wearing the same confidence I had seen from the beginning. Her posture remained perfect. Her smile remained controlled. To her, this was probably just another challenge to manage. Another problem she could explain away. I took my seat across the room and watched quietly. The hearing began with procedural matters. Property records, ownership history, survey certifications. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just facts. One by one, the documents established a timeline stretching back decades. My family's ownership, the trust records, tax payments, boundary confirmations. Every piece fit together cleanly. Patricia's legal team pushed back where they could, but ownership was never their strongest argument. They knew that. The room grew noticeably quieter when infrastructure records entered evidence. Large maps appeared on display screens. Easement diagrams, road alignments, utility corridors, engineering reviews. The same roads my grandfather told me to follow now sat projected 10 feet high for everyone to see. I watched residents lean forward in their seats. Some exchanged confused glances. Others studied the maps carefully. Then came the documents from Robert Kessler's archive. Internal reviews, planning notes, correspondence discussing unresolved authorization issues. The sound of pages turning filled the room. For the first time all morning, Patricia stopped smiling. The change was subtle. Most people probably missed it. I did not. Her fingers tightened around a pen. Her jaw shifted slightly. She knew exactly what those documents meant. The county examiner asked a simple question. Had responsible parties been aware of unresolved access authorization concerns during development? The answer came directly from records created years before. Yes, the words seemed to hang in the room. Not an accusation, not an opinion, a documented fact. The atmosphere changed immediately. Residents who had arrived expecting a routine property dispute suddenly realized something much larger was unfolding. The issue was no longer whether homes existed. The issue was how those homes had been allowed to expand across land subject to restrictions nobody bothered to resolve. One by one, assumptions began collapsing. The story Patricia spent years building started unraveling under its own weight. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody created a scene. That was the remarkable part. The truth did not arrive dramatically. It arrived quietly through documents, signatures, dates, and records. By late afternoon, The narrative controlling the valley for more than a decade looked very different. As people filed out of the hearing room, I noticed something I had not seen before. Residents were no longer looking at me like an outsider. They were looking at Patricia. And for the first time since I arrived in the valley, they were asking questions she could not easily answer. The final ruling arrived 23 days later. I remember the exact morning because the valley was wrapped in the same pale fog that greeted me the day I first drove toward that gate. The smell of wet pine drifted through the open cabin window as I stood on the porch holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. My phone rang just after 7:30. The moment I heard my attorney's voice, I knew. Years of assumptions, years of shortcuts, years of pretending paperwork did not matter had finally reached the end of the road. The ruling was comprehensive. Ownership remained with the Walker Family Trust. The protected land charter remained valid. The unauthorized access infrastructure could no longer support continued occupancy under its existing arrangements. Most importantly, the court authorized a structured legal removal process covering the portions of the community occupying restricted sections of the valley. Nobody was dragged out. Nobody lost their home overnight. Everything happened through lawful notices, relocation schedules, property settlements, and court-supervised procedures. Real life is rarely dramatic. Real justice is paperwork, deadlines, signatures, and patience. Yet somehow that made the outcome even more powerful. Over the following months, the valley slowly began changing. The first thing to disappear was the illusion. Residents finally learned the full history. Many were angry, not at me, at the people who never told them the truth. Community meetings that once celebrated expansion now focused on accountability. Board members resigned. Consultants distanced themselves. Investors who had treated the valley like a permanent asset suddenly discovered how fragile assumptions become when confronted by records. Patricia Holloway remained unusually quiet throughout the process. The woman who once seemed to appear everywhere became increasingly invisible. The confidence never completely vanished from her face, but the certainty did. One afternoon, I saw her standing outside the clubhouse staring at the mountains. For the first time since we met, she looked small, not defeated, just confronted by something she could not negotiate around. Reality. The smell of fresh-cut cedar filled the air several weeks later when crews began removing the massive entrance sign near the southern gate. I parked nearby and watched from my truck. Bolts loosened. Panels came down. The polished letters that had greeted residents for years disappeared piece by piece. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. The workers simply did their jobs. The same way justice had done its job. Quietly. Methodically. Inevitably. A month later, I returned to the overlook above the valley where I had once watched hundreds of lights flicker across the hillsides. The view looked different now. Several occupied sections had transitioned out of the restricted areas. Roadways were being reconfigured. Portions of the land were already returning to conservation status under the original charter. The transformation would take years to complete, but for the first time, it was moving in the right direction. Before sunset, I drove to the old gate one last time. The security checkpoint was gone. The barriers were gone. The residents' only sign that once blocked my path had vanished completely. In its place stood a simple wooden marker crafted by a local carpenter. Nothing fancy. No polished brass. No marketing slogans. Just a name carved into cedar. Walker Valley. The same name I remembered from childhood. The same name printed on the old map above my grandfather's fireplace. I stepped out of the truck and ran my hand across the wood. The rough texture felt real in a way those expensive signs never had. Wind moved through the pines. Somewhere in the distance, water flowed through a creek my grandfather used to show me when I was a boy. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice again. Follow the roads. He was right. The roads revealed everything. Not because they led to a courtroom. Not because they exposed a technical violation. They revealed something far more important. Every lie eventually reaches a dead end. Every shortcut eventually runs out of pavement. And every piece of land remembers who cared for it long before someone else arrived claiming it belonged to them. As the sun disappeared behind the western ridge, golden light spilled across 6,800 acres of valley that had finally found its way back home. I stood there until darkness settled over the mountains, listening to the silence. The kind of silence that only comes when a long story finally reaches its proper ending. Justice is not loud. It does not need a spotlight. It does not need revenge. Sometimes it only needs patience, records, and the willingness to follow the truth all the way to the end.